and he decided it must be because she loved him and he loved her. Having arrived at that conclusion, he had asked her to marry him, and upon the matchbox had marked the date and the hour. Since then she had given him many pretty presents, marked with her initials, marked with the crest, with strange cabalistic mottos that meant nothing to anyone save them. But the wooden matchbox was still the most valued of his possessions. As he rode into the valley, the rays of the moon fell fully upon him, and exposed him to the outpost as pitilessly as though he had been held in the circle of a searchlight. The bronzed Moses pushed cautiously through the screen of vines. There was a pause, and the rifle of the sergeant wavered. When he spoke, his tone was one of disappointment. "He is a scout riding alone," he said. "He is an officer," returned the sharpshooter excitedly. "The others follow. We should fire now and give the signal." "He is no officer, he is a scout," repeated the sergeant. "They have sent him ahead to study the trail and to seek us. He may be a league in advance. If we shoot him, we only warn others." Chesterton was within 50 yards. After an excited and anxious search, he had found the matchbox in the wrong pocket. The eyes of the sharpshooter frowned along the barrel of his rifle. With his chin pressed against the stock, he whispered swiftly from the corner of his lips, "He is an officer, and I am aiming where the strap crosses his heart. You aim at his belt. We fire together." The heat of the tropic night and the strenuous gallop had covered El Capitan with a lava of sweat. The reins upon his neck dripped with it. The gauntlets with which Chesterton held them were wet. As he raised the matchbox, it slipped from his fingers and fell noiselessly in the trail. With an exclamation, he dropped to the road and hit to his knees, groping in the dust, began an eager search. The sergeant caught at the rifle of the sharpshooter and pressed it down. "Look," he whispered, "he is a scout. He is searching the trail for the tracks of our ponies. If you fire, they will hear it a league away. But if he finds our trail and returns—" The sergeant shook his head. "I let him pass forward," he said grimly. "He will never return." Chesterton pounced upon the half-buried matchbox, and in a panic, lest he might again lose it, thrust inside his tunic. "Little do you know, El Capitan," he exclaimed breathlessly as he scrambled back into the saddle and lifted the pony into a gallop, "what a narrow escape I had. I almost lost it." Toward midnight they came to a wooden bridge swinging above a ravine in which a mountain stream 40 feet below splashed over half-hidden rocks and the stepping stones of the ford. Even before the campaign began, the bridge had outlived its usefulness, and the unwonted burden of artillery and the vibrations of marching men had so shaken it that it swayed like a house of cards, threatened by its own weight, at the mercy of the first tropic storm. It hung a death-trap for the one who first added to its burden. No sooner had El Capitan struck it squarely with his 4 hoofs, he then reared and whirling, sprang back to the solid earth. The suddenness of his retreat had all but thrown Chesterton, but he regained his seat, and digging the pony roughly with his spurs, pulled his head again toward the bridge. "What are you shying at now?" he panted. "That's a perfectly good bridge." For a minute horse and man struggled for the mastery, the horse spinning in short circles, the man pulling, tugging, urging him with knees and spurs. The first round ended in a draw. There were 2 more rounds with the advantage slightly in favour of El Capitan, for he did not approach the bridge. The night was warm and the exertion violent. Chesterton, puzzled and annoyed, paused to regain his breath and his temper. Below him, in the ravine, the shallow waters of Ford called to him, suggesting a pleasant compromise. He turned his eyes towards and saw hanging over the water what appeared to be a white bird upon the lower limb of a dead tree. He knew it to be an orchid, an especially rare orchid, and he knew also that the orchid was the favourite flower of Miss Armitage. In a moment he was on his feet, and with the reins over his arm was slipping down the bank, dragging El Capitan behind him. He ripped from the dead tree the bark to which the orchid was clinging, and with wet moss and grass packed it in his leather camera case. The camera he abandoned on the path. He always could buy another camera. He could not again carry a white orchid, plucked in the heart of the tropics on the night peace was declared to the girl he left behind him, followed by El Capitan, nosing and snuffing gratefully at the cool waters. He waded the ford and with his camera case swinging from his shoulder galloped up the opposite bank and back into the trail. A minute later, the bridge, unable to recover from the death blow struck by El Capitan, went whirling into the ravine and was broken upon the rocks below. Hearing the crash behind him, Chesterton guessed that in the jungle a tree had fallen. They had started at 6 in the afternoon and had covered 20 of the 40 miles that lay between Adhunters and Mayagis, when, just at the outskirts of the tiny village of Caguan, El Capitan stumbled, and when he arose painfully he again fell forward. Caguan was a little church, a little vine-covered inn, a dozen one-story adobe houses shining in the moonlight with whitewashed sepulchres. They faced a grass-grown plaza in the centre of which stood a great wooden cross. At one corner of the village was a corral, and in it many ponies. At the sight, Chesterton gave a cry of relief. A light showed through the closed shutters of the inn, and when he beat with his whip upon the door from the adobe houses, other lights shone, and white-clad figures appeared in the moonlight. The landlord of the inn was a Spaniard, fat and prosperous-looking, but for the moment his face was eloquent with such distress and misery that the heart of the young man, who was at peace with all the world, went instantly out to him. The Spaniard was less sympathetic. When he saw the khaki suit and the campaign hat, he scowled and ungraciously would have closed the door. Chesterton, apologizing, pushed it open. His pony, he explained, had gone lame, and he must have another, and at once the landlord shrugged his shoulders. These were war times, he said, and the American officer could take what he liked. They in Caguan were non-combatants and could not protest. Chesterton hastened to reassure him. The war, he announced, was over, and were it not, he was no officer to issue requisitions. He intended to pay for the pony. He unbuckled his belt and poured upon the table a handful of Spanish doubloons. The landlord lowered the candle and silently counted the gold pieces, and then calling to him 2 of his fellow villagers, crossed the tiny plaza and entered the corral. "The American pig," he whispered, "wishes to buy a pony. He tells me the war is over, that Spain has surrendered. We know that must be a lie. It is more probable he is a deserter. He claims he is a civilian, but that also is a lie, for he is in your uniform. You, Paul, sell him your pony and then wait for him at the first turn in the trail and take it from him." "He is armed," protested the one called Paul. "You must not give him time to draw his revolver," ordered the landlord. "You and Pedro will shoot him from the shadow. He is our country's enemy, and it will be in a good cause. He may carry dispatches. If we take them to the commandant at Mayagis, he will reward us." "And the gold pieces?" demanded the one called Paul. "We will divide them in 3 parts," said the landlord. In the front of the inn, surrounded by a ghost-like group that spoke its suspicions, Chesterton was lifting his saddle from El Capitan and rubbing the lame foreleg. It was not a serious sprain. A week would set it right, but for that night the pony was useless. Impatiently, Chesterton called across the plaza, begging the landlord to make haste. He was eager to be gone, alarmed and fearful lest even this slight delay should cause him to miss the transport. The thought was intolerable, but he was also acutely conscious that he was very hungry, and he was too old a campaigner to scoff at hunger. With the hope that he could find something to carry with him and eat as he rode forward, he entered the inn. The main room of the house was now in darkness, but a smaller room adjoining it was lit by candles, and by a tiny taper floating before a crucifix. In the light of the candles, Chesterton made out a bed, a priest bending over it, a woman kneeling beside it, and upon the bed the little figure of a boy who tossed and moaned. As Chesterton halted and waited hesitating, the priest strode past him, and in a voice dull and flat with grief and weariness, ordered those at the door to bring the landlord quickly. As one of the group leaped toward the corral, the priest said to the others, "There is another attack. I have lost hope." Chesterton advanced and asked if he could be of service. The priest shook his head. The child, he said, was the only son of the landlord, and much beloved by him and by all the village. He was now in the 3rd week of typhoid fever, and the period of hemorrhages. Unless they could be checked, the boy would die, and the priest, who for many miles of mountain and forest was also the only doctor, had exhausted his store of simple medicines. Nothing can stop the hemorrhage. He protested warily, but the strongest of drugs, and I have nothing. Chesterton bethought him of the medicine case Miss Armitage had forced upon him. I have given opium to the men for dysentery, he said. Would opium help you? The priest sprang at him and pushed him out of the door and toward the saddlebags. My children, he cried to the silent group in the plaza, God has sent a miracle. After an hour at the bedside, the priest said, he will live, and knelt. And the mother of the boy and the villagers knelt with him. When Chesterton raised his eyes, he found that the landlord, who had been silently watching while the 2 men struggled with death for the life of his son, had disappeared, but he heard, leaving the village along the trail to Mayagee's, the sudden clatter of a pony's hoofs. It moved like a thing driven with fear. The priest strode out into the moonlight. In the recovery of the child, he saw only a demonstration of the efficacy of prayer, and he could not too quickly bring home the lesson to his parishioners. Amid their murmurs of wonder and gratitude, Chesterton rode away to the kindly care of the priest he bequeathed El Capitan. With him also he left the gold pieces, which were to pay for the fresh pony. A quarter of a mile outside the village, 3 white figures confronted him. 2, who stood apart in the shadow, shrank from observation, but the landlord, seated bareback upon a pony that from late exertion was breathing heavily, called to him to halt. In the fashion of my country, he began grandiloquently, we have come this far to wish you God speed upon your journey. In the fashion of the American, he seized Chesterton by the hand. I thank you, Signor, he murmured. Not me, returned Chesterton, but the one who made me pack that medicine chest. Thank her, for tonight I think it saved her life. The Spaniard regarded him curiously, fixing him with his eyes as though deep in consideration. At last he smiled gravely. You are right, he said. Let us both remember her in our prayers. As Chesterton rode away, the words remained gratefully in his memory and filled him with pleasant thoughts. The world, he mused, is full of such kind and gentle souls. After an interminable delay, he reached Newport, and they escaped from the others. Miss Armitage and he ran down the lawn to the rocks and stood with the waves whispering at their feet. It was the moment for which each had so often longed, with which both had so often tortured themselves by living in imagination, that now that it was theirs, they were fearful it might not be true. Finally, he said, and the charm never failed. Indeed, it was wonderful. It stood by me so obviously. For instance, the night before San Juan in the mill at El Poso, I slept on the same poncho with another correspondent. I woke with a raging appetite for bacon and coffee, and he woke up out of his mind and with a temperature of 104. And again I was standing by Capron's gun at El Caney, when a shell took the 3 men who served it, and only scared me. And there was another time he stopped. Anyway, he laughed. Here I am. But there was one awful night, began the girl. She trembled, and he made this an added excuse for drawing her closer to him. When I felt you were in great peril, that you would surely die, and all through the night I knelt by the window and looked toward Cuba and prayed to God to let you live. Chesterton bent his head and kissed the tips of his fingers. After a moment, he said, would you know what night it was? It might be curious if I had been. Would I know? Cried the girl. It was 8 days ago, the night of the 12th, an awful night. 12th, exclaimed Chesterton, and laughed, and then begged her pardon humbly. I laughed because the 12th, he exclaimed, was the night peace was declared. The war was over, I'm sorry, but that night he was riding toward you, thinking only of you. I was never for a moment in danger. Okay, a tomb, vault or grave, and Mayaguez, that is how you pronounce that.
Mayaguez.
Yep, Mayaguez, so I was fucking that up. Fuck, I sweared. Well.